He's much stronger than most people realize. I'm talking about DJI.
The most valuable thing isn't actually their own products or technology. Outside the drone industry, DJI's success is no longer a given. Hello everyone, welcome to Album 51. We're a show that explores the growth stories of companies and brands.
Hi everyone, I'm Frank Wang Tao.
And I'm Hee-Chin Ming.
The name Album 51 was inspired by a very legendary photograph in history. Back in 1952, in an underground laboratory in London, a group of scientists spent 62 hours taking X-ray photos of human DNA. It wasn't until they took the 51st photo that they unlocked the mystery of the human double helix structure.
Our goal is to take a photo 51 for every major company or brand that impacts our lives.
So today, our lens is focused on a very legendary and mysterious company called DJI. The reason we call it mysterious is because there are very few reports about it in the media. Moreover, DJI's founder, Frank Wang, has hardly appeared in public in recent years, but this hasn't affected DJI's status. Since 2016, the US government has been cracking down on DJI's drones. Each time they try to suppress DJI, it actually serves as free publicity for them. That's why today, DJI's drones have captured over 70% of the entire drone market, which is an incredible achievement.
If you put that 70% market share into the context of the smartphone market, it would be equivalent to Apple, Samsung, Xiaomi, and Huawei combined reaching that much. It really is impressive.
And it's not just smartphones. Even in computers and headphones, no single brand has ever achieved what DJI has.
Moreover, DJI's profits are extremely impressive. Last year, their revenue was 50 billion RMB, but their net profit margin reached 40%. For comparison, Apple's net profit margin is only about 20%.
So how exactly did DJI get to where it is today? What kinds of difficulties did DJI encounter on its way to achieving this level of success, and what methodologies did it use? These are the key topics we'll be exploring in this episode. Of course, we'll also be providing you with a variety of different perspectives, stories, and challenges, as well as an overall look at the company's current state. Many of these aspects are not well known to outsiders, so in this segment, we want to share them with you.
Answering these questions is actually not easy. As I mentioned earlier, there is very little information available, but the more I research it, the more excited I get. DJI is finally starting to look like a normal company, especially in recent years as it moves toward. DJI has been expanding into markets beyond drones, for example, moving from aerial cameras to handheld devices, and now to some ground-based equipment. In fact, none of these products have achieved the same large-scale market share as consumer drones, especially the device we have here now, called the DJI S1. This product was discontinued just a few years after its launch, which is really a shame. If you want to play with it now, you can only buy it secondhand.
So it sounds like DJI doesn't have as much magic left as it used to, right?
This is what we wanted to introduce to everyone. Outside the drone field, DJI's success is no longer a given. Especially recently, DJI launched a product that really doesn't feel like a DJI product at all, a robot vacuum. Last year, I actually did an exclusive report on their development process for this robot vacuum. And now, after more than 4 years, it's finally been released. It was a very tangled process, but internally, their expectations for this product are extremely high. They believe that this generation of robot vacuum is to DJI what the Phantom drone was to DJI's drone business.
So the status of this product has actually been elevated very highly, but if we look at how they're making the robot vacuum today, it's completely different from when they made the Phantom back then. When they made the Phantom, the market competition wasn't nearly as fierce, and both their technology and products were leading the way. But today, when we look at them making a robot vacuum, there are already a lot of competitors on the market, and those competitors have also accumulated very strong technical capabilities and brand recognition.
Right, and the biggest challenge everyone faces when making robot vacuums isn't just about these brands or technologies, even if you have the technology. Those robot vacuum companies have poached a lot of people from DJI. In fact, their competitors are actually their own former employees, who are already using DJI's methods to make robot vacuums. For example, their main competitor is called Narwhal. Where is Narwhal located? It's right next to DJI's headquarters, Sky City, just a little over a 10-minute walk away. They recruited a lot of people from DJI to work on their flagship vacuum, so the robot vacuum is really just one aspect of the competitive landscape that DJI is facing right now. In addition, back in 2020, they also made a product called an outdoor power station. Its competitor was a company called EcoFlow. Yes, EcoFlow, because its founder also came from DJI. He was originally the head of DJI's battery R&D department, Wang Lei, and his office was right next to theirs. They were located very close to each other, which is why it was called EcoFlow. Eco, as in close. Everyone was basically standing on the same street at the same time.
So I feel that DJI has already been surrounded by its former colleagues. Of course, this surrounding is only in a geographical sense. They haven't really penetrated DJI's core business yet. For now, they haven't ventured into the drone business.
Yes, these people who left DJI actually have a lot of respect and awe for making drones. One of my investor friends went to talk to these entrepreneurs who came out of DJI and asked them why they don't make drones. There are a few types of answers. The first is that DJI's supply chain is extremely strong, their technology is extremely strong, their brand is extremely strong, and simply because they've worked with Frank Wang before. So none of them want to make drones, but that doesn't mean there aren't any other people in the market now. They don't want to go head-to-head with DJI, but just 8 kilometers from DJI's headquarters, there's a company in Shenzhen called Insta360. This company recently announced that they're going to enter the drone business. Actually, it's not much of a secret within the industry, but what's very obvious about this company is that they're choosing to enter a red ocean market. They believe that a red ocean market proves there is real demand, and the fiercer the competition, the more profit potential there is. Their first product was a 360-degree camera. At that time, the best ones were made by Samsung and Ricoh from Japan, but they decided to do it themselves. They used a complete set of R&D methodologies to beat both of those companies and became the leader in the 360-degree camera field themselves. And what about DJI? When they heard that someone nearby was coming to challenge their dominance in drones, their reaction was also very intense. Weren't you originally making 360-degree cameras? So we also saw DJI immediately release their own 360-degree camera in direct response. In fact, this has been the most complex competitive situation DJI has faced since 2016.
But I think that while the competition is indeed fierce, DJI has always remained DJI. Over a decade ago, they had already proven themselves as the industry leader, and almost no one has been able to successfully challenge them. You just mentioned this. Insta360's founder Liu Jingkang has also said that what everyone sees on the surface is DJI. And the real DJI is completely different. There are so many impressive things about DJI that people simply don't know about. It's much stronger than most people realize, and it has employed a great many of these.
So from DJI's development journey, we can actually see how DJI established this kind of methodology or capability. Our first stop takes us back to 1980. That year, Wang Tao was born in Hangzhou, Zhejiang, into an intellectual family. His father was an engineer and his mother was a teacher. By the standards of the time, their family was quite well off, but his parents weren't exactly content to just settle down. After the reform and opening up, they went straight to Shanghai to do business. So when Wang Tao was young, he followed his parents to Shenzhen. When Wang Tao was 10, in 3rd grade, his parents were too busy with their business. And perhaps also because Wang Tao was already quite independent, they sent him back to Hangzhou to be fostered with a teacher's family.
So it's kind of like, in quotes, the feeling of being a left-behind child.
It's actually hard for Wang Tao to relate to the typical experience of left-behind children, but it did fit the circumstances at the time. It might sound a bit strange, but after all, he did grow up independently. However, he's not quite the same as the broader definition of a left-behind child. Wang Tao's parents actually provided him with a lot of support and encouragement to explore his own interests. In 2015, Wang Tao went to Shenzhen University, which is also your alma mater. He went to give a commencement speech for the new students and mentioned something like this. He said he was very grateful that when he was a child he read a comic book about a red helicopter, which made him fascinated with the sky. From then on, he especially loved reading books about model aircraft, so we also found it. The book that inspired Wang Tao at the time was actually one from the Grandpa Brain teaser series, but in this book there was actually very little content related to helicopters. There were only 2.5 pages with less than 500 words, mainly talking about what helicopters can do. They can spray pesticides, carry cables, and perform some military tasks.
So many people say that it was this book that gave Wang Tao the dream of making drones, right? But at that time it was still about helicopters, which didn't really have much to do with drones.
For a long period of time, even after founding DJI, the main focus of his research was actually still on helicopters. It was only later that it shifted to drones, the multi-rotor drones we see every day. Later on, his parents also worked hard to nurture his interests. For example, as mentioned earlier, they would buy him model aircraft magazines, and they would also use this approach to motivate their own child. They told Frank Wang, as long as you get good grades, I'll buy you the remote-controlled helicopter you like. So Frank Wang studied really hard, and his grades improved quite quickly. His parents were also very straightforward. They spent over 10,000 yuan to buy him a remote-controlled helicopter in Hong Kong.
So spending over 10,000 yuan in the 1990s shows that their family was actually quite well off.
But after the helicopter was brought home, Frank Wang broke it not long after playing with it. Normally at this point, most parents would think, forget it, don't play with it anymore.
Stop playing with it.
But his parents made a different choice. They gave him the phone number of the Hong Kong manufacturer and let him contact the company himself to figure out how to get replacement parts. They wanted him to fix it on his own, so
he really did manage to fix it.
He fixed it per reports.
That's what the report said. And honestly, that's not easy at all, because as a high school student, after you get the parts, you have to take it apart and put it back together yourself. This shows that he truly had a passion for helicopters.
It's this kind of passion, but to turn that passion into a fervent pursuit, he still needed an opportunity. As we just mentioned, at this point Wang Tao was about to go to college, and the university he attended was a 985 school, which is quite good. It was a university. Yeah, he majored in electronics. According to the script of a successful entrepreneur, this was actually pretty close to the goal he wanted to pursue. But Wang Tao dropped out in his junior year, and after dropping out, it wasn't to start a business. Instead, he applied to Stanford and MIT. These are some of the top universities in the world, but unsurprisingly, his applications were unsuccessful. He didn't get in.
So I think his decision was pretty strange. Normally, if someone makes it to their junior year, they'd probably think, I only have 1 year left, I might as well tough it out, finish my degree, and then maybe apply for grad school. But not him. He just erased the first 3 years as if they never happened.
Yeah, but he was pretty lucky. At that time, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology had a special program. Students from mainland China didn't need to take the joint entrance exam, they could just submit application materials. If the university reviewed your materials and found you qualified, you could get in. I think you should come for an interview, and if you pass, you can start your undergraduate studies here. At that time, the acceptance rate was about 3%. Although Wang Tao didn't have the ability to get into Stanford or MIT, he still had some strength, so he was able to get into the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology for his undergraduate studies. Actually, when I saw this part of his experience, I felt that Wang Tao was a lot like a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. Wang Tao is also a bit of a paranoid, right? He even made a decision that if he couldn't get into these schools, he would drop out and start over from the 3rd year of high school. He would take the college entrance exam again just to pursue what he truly wanted.
But at that time, he actually didn't have any entrepreneurial dreams yet.
His goal was actually just to study at a good school overseas.
Yes.
In fact, after going to the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, it also provided him with a great learning environment where he could find like-minded classmates and participate in robotics competitions together. However, luck was not on his side. The first time he participated in a robotics competition, he ended up suffering a crushing defeat, and Wang Tao had prepared very thoroughly for it. He never even considered the possibility of failure, so this experience gave him a very important lesson in management. He summed it up with the phrase, "Bring only your brain, not your emotions." After he founded DJI, he even posted these 8 words at the entrance of his office. This was because the day before the competition, one of his teammates had an emotional outburst, which ultimately led to a poor result in the contest. However, as he was about to graduate with his bachelor's degree, Wang Tao participated in the robotics competition once again. This time, he did quite well. He won the championship in the Hong Kong region and tied for 3rd place in the Asia-Pacific region.
I feel that these successful people all share some very common traits. For example, in Wang Tao, the trait of I must win is especially strong. As an undergraduate, after 3 years of dissatisfaction, he decided to start over, insisting on getting into his desired school. The same goes for competitions. If he didn't do well initially, he'd participate again, always fighting on despite setbacks. This determination is particularly evident. And actually, Wang Tao isn't a genius, or at least he doesn't seem like one. His academic performance was above average, but not outstanding, and even in competitions, his results weren't the very best. But I feel that his spirit is as rare as that of a genius.
Yes, and he never forgot why he came to HK Ost. The title of his undergraduate thesis was Autonomous Hover Flight Control System for Helicopters.
The helicopter can hover in the air by itself.
The key point is autonomous hovering, because at that time, making a remote-controlled helicopter hover in the air, actually, an experienced pilot, through precise manual control, could make it hover there, but the prerequisite is that you need a highly skilled person to do it.
So at that time, you had to use a remote control to operate the helicopter in the air. What we wanted was for it to hover in the air by itself without anyone controlling it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one key point. Another key point is the helicopter flight control system. The helicopter I'm talking about isn't the kind of large transport helicopter you see in documentaries, but rather a small helicopter. It's a model aircraft, slightly bigger than a remote-controlled helicopter, but it can still perform certain tasks when it's in the air. However, building such a system is very complex. It requires not only hardware. This hardware includes the helicopter itself, which is the primary object I need to control. In addition, there are hardware devices for receiving signals transmitted from the ground, and you also need equipment to send those signals. All of these require assembling various components. Of course, you also need software to make the whole system function. It's extremely complex, especially for an undergraduate. So, the first thing Wang Tao did when he started this project was to look for funding. At that time, HKOST also supported its students in exploring their own projects, so he managed to secure Hong Kong dollars 18,000 in funding, even competing with other students to get it. In addition, he found 2 classmates to help him work on this project. Actually, at this point, you can already sense the qualities in Wang Tao starting to emerge.
Qualities like an entrepreneur, finding funding, recruiting, technical skills, and building a team to accomplish something.
But at this point, entrepreneurship still wasn't Wang Tao's own goal. Next comes an experience of Wang Tao's that truly became a turning point, leading him to fully embrace entrepreneurship. It was when Wang Tao worked on this project himself and motivated his classmates to join him in the grind. While working on this project, he stayed up late every night until 5 in the morning, keeping up this pace for nearly half a year, and finally, they managed to complete it. After completing it, on the day of the graduation project evaluation, he received a C. What does a C mean? At H cost, all undergraduate graduation projects are graded as A+, A, B+, B, and C. So a C is a very low score. At the time, many media outlets reported, "Oh, this is Wang Tao's helicopter," and it crashed. The professor thought his work wasn't good enough, so he gave him a low grade. But actually, there's another version of this story, which comes from the professor who gave him the C. The professor himself wrote a blog post in 2019 specifically explaining why he gave Wang Tao such a low grade. It was because Wang Tao's helicopter just sat on the lawn for half an hour and never managed to take off. He also said that when he went to watch Wang Tao's helicopter demonstration himself, there were a lot of other students watching too. This is a flight control system. If it can't even take off, there's really no excuse.
Right, at least if it could take off and then crash, it would still prove that your thing works. At least show that it can work, right? So
this incident was a huge blow to Wang Tao. As was just mentioned, teacher Wang Lixin wrote a passage in that podcast saying that after all these years, Wang Tao's image in his mind has become very blurry, but he just can't forget the beads of sweat on Wang Tao's forehead. Because when Wang Tao was debugging that unmanned helicopter, he kept saying, "Don't worry, it'll be fine. Don't worry, it'll be fine." When he turned to leave, he still remembers the look of despair in Wang Tao's eyes as he walked away.
But in the end, he still managed to get into graduate school at HCUST, right? But
at that point, going to graduate school was already a deviation from his original goal. Because the teacher who recommended him, Professor Li Zekai, we also have colleagues who have spoken with him, his most outstanding trait is his leadership in education, specifically in what's called new engineering education. He said, "When I train students, I don't hope for them to go work in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street. Instead, I hope my students can go to use new technologies to create new products." Wang Tao really embodied these qualities.
It was more hands-on and also encouraged them to start their own businesses.
So in 2006, Wang Tao started his graduate studies. That year, he also founded DJI.
That's right.
After that, Wang Tao's graduate studies, which were supposed to take 2 years, ended up taking more than 4 years before he graduated.
Well, since I couldn't get into my dream school, I might as well start my own business. I'll treat graduate school as a transitional phase and use my spare time to work on my startup.
Right, so Professor Wang Lixin also once said, "I ruined an outstanding scholar, but I helped create a source of pride for China's high-tech industry."
Trying to make himself feel better.
Yeah, actually Wang Tao's entrepreneurial journey was very straightforward. The main core was actually the flight control system from his undergraduate graduation project. So before starting his business, he spent a long time in his dorm at HCUST trying to figure out why the helicopter wouldn't fly. After finally solving the problem, he moved to Shenzhen to start his business. In fact, at that time, Miao, over there's the Sunshine Golf building where his uncle worked. His very first startup location was actually in the storage room of his uncle's magazine company, about 20 square meters, like a garage startup, a bit like the Shenzhen version of a garage. The early employees were people he met through participating in that robotics competition. He attracted a few people by achieving a great ranking, and the initial funding mainly came from his family. They gave him 200,000 yuan. Later, they moved to a private house near Lianhuashan Park that belonged to a mountain recluse. There's actually an early photo of the four of them together, and anyone who sees the background can immediately tell it was taken at Lianhuashan Park.
Back then, his approach to entrepreneurship was completely different from that of many people starting consumer electronics businesses today. He was purely driven by his own passion. He probably never imagined that drones would become a 100 billion yuan market in the future. Nowadays, people pick markets and choose tracks, strategizing over all these things. But he didn't think about any of that. He just thought, I like helicopters, so that's what I want to do.
Right, and at the beginning, Wang Tao's ambitions weren't even that big. He said, "I just want to run a small company with 10 to 20 people, that's enough."
That's it.
He chose a very difficult path, but it was also a path with certain advantages. Next, let's talk about why it was difficult. At that time, developing flight control systems for small aircraft, it's not that no one was working on it, but most people were focused on developing flight control systems for fixed-wing aircraft, basically scaled-down versions of large planes like Airbus, Boeing, or even fighter jets. Developing flight control systems in that direction had a major advantage. The flight control systems for this type of aircraft are relatively simple. By 1930, these systems had already been put into commercial use. At that time, pilots could hand over control directly to the flight control system, and the plane could fly on its own, even take off and land by the 1990s. This kind of control system was feasible, but what they were working on back then was a control system for small aircraft. There was a rather significant problem, as I just mentioned. They were essentially a scaled-down version of a large aircraft. The sensors used on large aircraft were originally very big. In the early days, each of those sensors weighed dozens of kilograms, but a small aircraft might only weigh a few dozen kilograms in total. So the first major challenge they faced was how to miniaturize the sensors used on large aircraft so they could fit into these smaller ones. Developing a flight control software based on these miniaturized sensors is actually...
At that time, I think they really hit a great timing, which was around 2006, because something very important was about to happen. Smartphones were about to become widespread. The next year, the iPhone would be released, and smartphones had a very important feature. The key components are these microsensors. Many of the functions we use, like the shake feature on smartphones, basically rely on these sensors to work. So when smartphones became widespread, the technology for these sensors matured very quickly. Other industries essentially helped the drone industry perfect this whole set of components.
Right.
Including what we see today in many so-called smart aggregation devices. For example, many of the motors and electronic controls used by these companies are basically improved and perfected thanks to the efforts of electric vehicle companies. That's why a lot of smart device companies recruit talent from the electric vehicle industry. They don't have to rely solely on the development within their own field, but can leverage the strengths of other industries.
Yes, as we just mentioned, Wang Tao actually chose a more difficult path, but now, by choosing this direction, the opportunities are even greater. The fixed-wing flight control systems we just mentioned are the kind used on commercial flights we usually take.
Yeah.
We know that these airplanes need a runway for takeoff and landing, and fixed-wing aircraft have a major drawback. They can't hover.
Right.
In theory, they just can't hover at all.
They can fly forward.
They have to keep flying until they land.
Mm-hmm.
But the helicopters Wang Tao is working on take off and land vertically.
Yeah.
In theory, they can also hover, but developing them is more complicated because controlling a helicopter's takeoff, landing, and turning all relies on the main rotor on top. That's why we also see that helicopter accidents happen much more frequently than those involving airplanes. Also, when a helicopter takes off, its rotor spins in one direction, which makes it very easy for the entire body of the helicopter to start spinning as well. So, maintaining balance and control is extremely difficult. We've seen that many accidents happen because the helicopter starts spinning in circles and then crashes.
At that time, there really weren't many people working on helicopter hovering or helicopter control systems, right? This is actually quite different from industries like mobile phones or computers, because in China, when it came to making phones or computers, Europe and the US had already been developing for many years. But when it came to developing these kinds of aircraft systems, it seems like everyone was basically developing at the same time.
Especially with helicopter flight control systems, but no one was working on it. That also meant it was difficult. So after they started their business, they quickly ran into their first hurdle. Where do I sell this thing, and who do I sell it to?
No wonder no one was doing it, maybe because no one wanted it.
Yes, at that time, one of the main sales channels for these small aircraft was industry exhibitions. Basically, I would put my product at, say, a model aircraft exhibition, and some people would come by and take a look. If they saw something new that they could use, they'd buy it and take it home. But when Wang Tao started his business, he didn't have any money and couldn't afford to rent a booth at these events, so he chose another way. He made his own videos. It was just to showcase his own product. He posted it on online forums for model aircraft enthusiasts, and he actually managed to sell it. The first set sold for 50,000 yuan, but the cost was only 15,000, so the profit margin was 70%. Back then, people bought this helicopter flight control system for pretty much the same uses as today. That is, I would take a camera up to have a look from the sky to see things from an aerial perspective that ground cameras just can't capture. But there were also some essential needs, and those needs required your helicopter flight control system to be especially good. For example, when it comes to power grid inspections, I saw that in the early days it was extremely dangerous. Those transport helicopters would fly over, and someone would actually sit on the landing gear with a tool, tapping to check whether the line was live or if there were any issues.
So the problem is, you can't just hang a camera there and watch. You still need people to try things out manually.
Yes, for those especially complex scenarios, this kind of approach is necessary. But if my helicopter can hover here, I can actually see whether there's a problem with the power line.
So
this ability to hover is especially crucial. Although Wang Tao's undergraduate thesis was about developing an autonomous hovering flight control system for helicopters, up to now, he still hasn't fully solved the problem of autonomous hovering. Even though at that time his profit margins were high and the demand was low, even with low demand, it was still a good business. But when they were making this product, especially this kind of aircraft, there was a huge problem because the R&D costs were extremely high. It's not like developing a smartphone. If my phone's system has a bug, I can just debug and fix it directly. But when you're testing a helicopter and encounter a
bug, it crashes and you have to replace it with a new one.
Right, crash here means that in drone aerial photography, a crash means it falls out of the sky.
Yes.
If you drop it a few times, this thing will be useless. More than 10,000. So, not long after he started his business, his 200,000 yuan quickly ran out. At this time, he also encountered another problem. His team left, and the main problem was that they had disagreements on the equity distribution. Because the few people who started the business with him felt that we all started from scratch together. So shouldn't we get a bigger share of the equity? But Wang Tao felt otherwise. Why should I give you so much? The technology is mine, and my contribution is big enough, so I should get the largest share.
That makes sense, because for startups, the last thing you want is to split the equity evenly. Many investors are reluctant to invest in companies like that, because once you split it evenly, in the end, there will be a lot of disputes. For example, that autonomous driving company in Shenzhen, Roadstar, was like this. Because a few people split the equity evenly, no one wanted to give in, and eventually the team broke up.
Actually, it wasn't recently, it was a while ago.
Long time ago.
Right, you always see companies like this popping up. Those investors say, when I see a startup with evenly split equity, I just turn around and leave. I won't invest at all. Of course, it's mainly because this whole system was developed by Wang Tao himself. Wang Tao also paid the price for making this choice. Teacher Li Zhenshan continued to share with us what everyone was like back then. In the end, besides Wang Tao, there was only a cashier left, everyone else was gone. And after these people left, they still tried to take advantage of everyone. First, they took the products and technology that Wang Tao had developed and tried to sell them elsewhere, and they even used DJI's equipment to help them test their products. They tried to take advantage to the very end. After seeing this, Wang Tao was furious and said he wanted to find a lawyer to sue them. When he found a lawyer, the first thing the lawyer said was, "Give me 700,000 yuan and I'll help you sue." Where was he supposed to get 700,000 yuan? Exactly, he didn't have that kind of money. When he was at his wit's end, he went to look for Professor Li Zhiqiang, who was his undergraduate thesis advisor and also his graduate supervisor. He was also a key supporter for everyone. At that time, Professor Li was in class, so Wang Tao waited outside for more than 2 hours. Actually, when I saw this part, I couldn't help but wonder what Wang Tao was thinking during those 2 hours. It must have been agonizing. After class, Professor Li said that he actually couldn't do much to help, that he really couldn't offer much assistance. The biggest help he could provide was to introduce people to everyone. For the students, actually, there's some background here. In 2004, Li Zhiqiang had a collaboration with the Shenzhen Graduate School of Harbin Institute of Technology, and they set up a graduate class. By 2007, when it was time for this group to graduate, he suggested that they either do internships at DJI or stay on at the company. These people actually helped Wang Tao rebuild DJI. As for funding, Professor Li really wasn't able to provide much help at the time. The person who offered financial support was a friend of Wang Tao's father. This person was Lu Di, who happened to be in the restaurant business at the time. He had made some money himself and invested 500,000 yuan in DJI. With this funding and talent, DJI was able to catch its breath and get back on its feet. At this point, Wang Tao was also reflecting on his past, not-so-successful experiences and decided to break up the original integrated flight control system and sell the components separately. As mentioned earlier, at that time, most of what they were working on was fixed-wing flight control systems. Another trend was that people liked to DIY, and most of their main customers were enthusiasts and geeks. So, they started selling these as individual parts, which sold much better than the complete sets they used to offer. They quickly cleared out their inventory, and their financial situation or economic pressure eased a bit as a result.
Overall, his entire journey of chasing his dreams wasn't actually that smooth. When he was a kid, he bought a helicopter, but it broke after just a couple of tries. Then he ended up studying for 2 undergraduate degrees, wanted to study abroad but didn't manage to go, and now it seems like his company has also hit a bottleneck.
Yeah, you can't really say it was about to go completely under, but it definitely took a pretty significant hit, quite a big one. There's an entrepreneur in the drone industry named Yang Jianjun. He's the founder of Zerotech Intelligence, and we'll talk more about this company later. Back in 2008, he went to meet Wang Tao, mainly with the intention of buying DJI's flight control code. He offered 150,000 yuan.
He wanted to buy the core technology?
Yes, but obviously Wang Tao didn't want to sell, because he'd already invested much more than 150,000 yuan into it. But Yang Jianjun thought that if it cost more than that, he might as well develop it himself. So in the end, this collaboration didn't happen. But Yang Jianjun was left with an impression of Wang Tao. He felt that at that time, Wang Tao was very humble and also quite dejected. Wang Tao kept telling him that this industry was tough, and he wasn't sure if he should keep going.
That image is completely different from the Wang Tao we see today. Because now, or at least in recent years, the image Wang Tao has presented in the media is somewhat cynical. He'll say things like, "This world is so stupid, unbelievably stupid," or "There's no one in this world worthy of my admiration." Maybe not even Steve Jobs. These two images are a stark contrast to each other.
Right, but then a turning point came. In 2008, DJI launched its first generation flight control system called XP 3.1. Compared to previous systems, this generation finally solved the problem of autonomous hovering technology.
That means their helicopter could finally automatically just stay in the air and hover by itself.
Yes, this was actually his undergraduate graduation project, but it wasn't until 2 years after he graduated that he finally solved it. Of course, the margin of error at that time was still quite large, about 1 to 3 meters, but it was usable. This flight control system also helped them establish a solid foothold. We also looked into how he solved this problem and found their operating gestures. He wrote this passage saying, "I drew inspiration from the inertial navigation technology used in cruise missiles and combined it with advanced control algorithms to achieve this."
His inspiration comes from cruise missiles.
Technology.
The technical inspiration is very good. I think he probably couldn't have imagined that today he would often have to fight with these cruise missiles all over the world, right?
But at that time, there was one thing I still want to say. There were indeed many entrepreneurs doing flight control who were taking on some military projects.
Because
military projects are research-oriented and can provide them with funding and also support the team. But internally, some people would say, should we do some military projects ourselves? And Wang Tao just wasn't willing. He said we should still make consumer-grade products. That is to say, teacher Li Zhiqiang was also very supportive of him. That year, he and his colleagues at Harbin Institute of Technology, His colleague at the Shenzhen Graduate School, Zhu Xiaorui, the chief scientist, she called herself the chief scientist, and together everyone invested 1 million yuan in Wang Tao. At this point, Wang Tao and his team also moved their office into an office building, finally making things a bit more proper. In fact, their operation manual actually included another sentence, which I think is quite crucial for understanding DJI's development or the company itself. The sentence went like this: even if you're a beginner, you can start using our flight control system within a few minutes. Really make good use of this flight control system. At that time, for those working on flight control systems, as mentioned earlier, most of them were DIY enthusiasts or geeks. They didn't mind if something was really complicated or difficult to handle, because the more complex and challenging it was, the greater the sense of accomplishment when they succeeded. So when Wang Tao worked on autonomous hovering, he was also in a way considering the needs of users. Specifically, he was thinking about beginners.
Previously, no one really cared about novice users.
Yeah, actually, if you talk about product market fit, then my market was really just these dedicated hobbyists.
Right,
So as long as I served them well, it was simple for me, whether it was making things easier or developing autonomous hovering technology, but later on it turned out to be extremely important, even though at the time it didn't seem so obvious.
This is actually quite important because we saw that later on, DJI's series of products became very easy to use, and in a way that's what really opened up the market. For example, our office recently bought a Tuoju 3D printer, which was also created by a former DJI executive who started his own business. But later, I realized that because I usually have a strong aversion to these kinds of printers or high-tech gadgets, I always thought they were hard to use. But after flipping through just a couple of pages of the manual, I found it was actually really easy to print something. So I did some research and discovered that when Tuoju was founded in 2020, there were already quite a few companies making 3D printers on the market, but almost no one was seriously serving the general public or beginner users. Most of them were still targeting enthusiasts or the industrial sector. But as soon as Tuoju lowered the entry and technical barriers to the minimum, it immediately became a hot company in the market. So it's very clear that the key point here is that for consumer electronics products, the ease of use and how user-friendly they are determine how much market potential you have. Maybe you thought it was a small market before, but once you lower the usage barrier to the minimum, the market suddenly opens up. People didn't realize they could use this product to solve so many things in their lives, or they didn't even know they had this need themselves.
Yes, so after the release of the XP 3.1 non-official system, DJI's revenue quickly stabilized at 100,000 yuan per month, or even several hundred thousand, and at this point the company also reached break-even. In fact, this phase of their journey was completed quite quickly. So in the following years, everyone kept iterating around the XP 3.1 system, for example, by adding ground machines, which are somewhat like the mothership in an aircraft carrier. The ground equipment that transmits signals is strong enough. That way, when my helicopter flies over, it can go even farther and carry out more complex tasks. On the other hand, they also worked on a project with HCUST, where they used their flight control system to fly over Mount Everest. At that time, it was also the first small aircraft in the world to fly over, so HCUST did a lot of publicity for them and kept quite a few high-definition photos. In fact, these are some of the very rare high-definition photos of Wang Tao.
But what DJI was making back then was completely different from what we see today, right? It was just a system that you had to install on a model, not a complete machine like we see today. And it was designed for helicopters, not for... Now, what we see are these aircraft with multiple propellers, right? Flying in the air.
So Wang Tao wanted to transform and start making multi-rotor flight systems. That's when they developed the XP 3.1. A year later, multi-rotor aircraft, basically the form of drones we see today, came into being.
These are the ones with 4 propellers, or 6 or more, right?
Yes, it's already become very mature. In 2009, there was actually a movie released. I don't know if you must have seen it. Think about 3 Idiots. I don't know if you remember, there was a scene in it.
There was a drone flying with its mouth open.
Yes, that's the one. The multi-rotor flying there, the multi-rotor drone flying around. That year, actually, a lot of domestic entrepreneurs were working on related projects, and they also developed some hardware. Wang Tao noticed these things too, so he went and bought one. He wanted to try it out to see how good it actually was, but after testing it, he found that it crashed not long after taking off, and it couldn't even hover. So he thought, what's the point of studying this? After that, he just focused on developing his own helicopter flight controller again. But in the following years, all the signals around him were telling him that multi-rotor drones were the future. Let me just mention a few examples. First, as we just talked about, Professor Zhu Xiaorui went to the US to attend an academic conference and found that many people were using this kind of multi-rotor aircraft for their projects. After coming back, he told Wang Tao that this was the trend, and DJI's overseas distributors also told DJI that now there are very few customers buying your helicopter-related products. Instead, they're buying your components to use in multi-rotor aircraft. Also, on those hobbyist websites that Wang Tao and his team often visited, more and more people were discussing multi-rotor options.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, looking at it now with a more experienced perspective, having 4 or 6 rotors does seem to be more stable than a helicopter with just one rotor.
That's right, so what Wang Tao and his team did wasn't particularly complicated. So in August 2011, they released their own flight control system, but it was called Wukong M. Actually, this system was based on their helicopter flight control system, which was called the H series. So that's the direct connection between helicopters and multi-rotors.
Basically, the technical barrier in between isn't that high.
Yeah, for most people, it's actually not that hard. But at this point, Wang Tao did something a bit unusual. He went to seek funding.
They weren't profitable yet at that time, right?
At that time, actually, they had just broken even.
Oh, then seeking funding seems pretty strange. I mean, as a consumer electronics company, if you can support yourself financially, have stable operations and steady cash flow, you really shouldn't need to seek funding, or at least there's no real need to. Plus, as we've mentioned before, Wang Tao's image seems to be that he's not someone who likes to share profits that much.
Yeah, at that time he had a few predictions. The first was that competition would become extremely fierce because making these multi-rotor flight control systems like DJI does isn't actually that difficult. But it wasn't that hard for other competitors to do it either. As we just mentioned, multi-rotor flight control had already been developing for many years. So who were the people working on multi-rotor flight control at that time? They were all those DIY-loving geeks, and as we just discussed, these people have a particular trait. They especially love open source.
Yeah.
It was really this group that started the open source wave, so they also made the open source software for multi-rotor aircraft really good.
So all could do it.
At this point, Wang Tao had to make a choice. Either continue to focus on this flight control software, perfect it, and make it extremely powerful, basically with no competitors, or the other option was to give his product even greater value, not just making the software, but also developing the hardware, creating an integrated solution, kind of like what Apple does. Vertical integration, right?
Isn't that exactly what Steve Jobs said? That people who truly take software seriously will eventually make their own hardware. Even though there might be some marketing or hype in that statement, it does make sense.
Yeah, but for everyone, it's just a choice to make. There are also many software companies that are very powerful, yes, and when they compete, they say you have to make great software to become truly successful. But at this point, if they wanted to make hardware, the first thing they needed was money, because developing hardware still requires more capital than software. So at the beginning, they approached the boss of a company called Zhongyu Electronics, whose name is Qian Yu. At that time, he was already a big name in the fixed-wing aircraft field.
Yeah, he was good at making those big airplanes.
Scaled down.
Right?
Scaled down versions. And actually, the other party also wanted to do a multi-choice deal, and they agreed. They were willing to invest 30 million for everyone. At that time, Yang Jianjun went to find him.
It increased?
200.
Right.
But he had one more condition, just like Yuan Jianjun. You have to share the code with me. Then Wang Tao still wasn't willing, so the collaboration fell through. But soon, they didn't need that investment anymore, because after he released his multi-rotor aerial system, the Wukong M, the market response was fantastic. Very quickly, his annual income surpassed 10 million, so he didn't need any more money. He had enough funds for hardware development.
So, was it because his flight control system had the hovering function, or was it just that his product was better than other open source products?
Yes. The product he made was good because he had accumulated experience with helicopter flight control systems.
Right.
Although Wang Tao and his team did refer to open source software, they had their own unique technology, so it was much better than those open source solutions.
Could those open source solutions even hover?
Actually, the hovering function was something they kept working on and improving over time.
So at that time, it didn't exist yet.
Yes, at that time, hovering was still a very complex technology. Maybe some teams could solve it, but DJI's solution was relatively simple and also not that expensive. So everyone still had a pretty good market share. So at that point, once they had some money, they developed 2 pieces of hardware, which were actually the prototypes for later drones. You might not have heard of these 2 devices. One was designed to work with their Wukong system. The hardware was called Jinduyun, and the other one was made to go with their Neja series. Their Neja series included some... Right, so the Neja series was meant for regular consumers. But as for these 2 pieces of hardware, the public's awareness of them wasn't that strong. The most recognized and successful product was still the Phantom. So at that time, these 2 products, these 2 pieces of hardware, they also underwent a lot of localization for Western markets. For example, even though we called them Wukong and Neja, their names were actually English words. For instance, Wukong, oh, that...
This is quite different from what we've seen in the past couple of years. Take Black Myth, Wukong, for example. It directly uses the pinyin for Wukong. When the Neja movie was released overseas, they also just used the pinyin for Neja. After more than a decade, it feels like people's attitudes have completely changed.
Yes, but at that time, Chinese products still weren't seen as very strong by the outside world. So even though these 2 products weren't successful, they actually laid a lot of groundwork for what came next, like the development of elves, which was also a key turning point for everyone to really take off. Jingling was actually just the Chinese name for the product for that generation of products. Its English name was Phantom. The meaning of phantom leans towards something like a ghost, something that exists but you can't perceive. I don't know if it's because DJI was especially successful, but I feel like this name, it really creates a special atmosphere.
Isn't this just a question of tracing things back? Maybe the name just popped into someone's head in a dream, or was a sudden flash of inspiration, and then later people insist on attaching all sorts of meaning to it.
Right, and the reason we're talking about this name is because there was actually a dispute over it, which was also related to DJI's later development.
So
the starting point here is that we have to go back to July 2011, which was a month before DJI released their multi-rotor flight control system. This is another side story, but in a moment, we'll tie it back into the main storyline. At that time, Wang Tao went to the US to attend a gathering of enthusiasts, a meetup for tech geeks, where he met someone named Colin Gwynn. Colin had participated in the reality show, The Amazing Race, but was now starting his own business. He had started an aerial photography company that specialized in shooting sky-high perspectives for Hollywood studios. At that time, he encountered a huge problem. When the multi-rotor drones with cameras flew up, they shook terribly.
yeah,
So once it started shaking, the footage became unusable.
that's when you need a gimbal, right?
Yes, at that time he knew that Wang Tao and his team were developing this kind of gimbal. In fact, the value of a gimbal was obvious to everyone in the industry. After all, the whole point of mounting a camera on a drone is to take pictures, and the clearer the footage, the higher its value. But most people in the industry, what most people really like to do was just wait for a miracle to happen. They thought, I can use the standard solution, it's not like it doesn't work and everyone can accept it.
No one really thought about actually solving the problem.
Right?
Yeah.
But Wang Tao and his team started developing this kind of gimbal very early on. At first, they also used the standard industry solution, which was what professionals call a brushed motor. So what about brushed motors? They have two problems. First, their frequency and precision aren't sufficient. When a drone is flying, the vibration from its rotors has a characteristic frequency. The gimbal's job is to counteract that frequency and eliminate the vibration, but the motor just can't keep up. So there would still be some shaking, and as these motors are used over time, they wear out. And once they do, the vibrations become much more severe. Back then, Wang Tao and his team searched for a long time and finally found a solution. They switched to brushless direct drive motors. Nowadays, this doesn't seem all that complicated. It's the same kind used in electric toothbrushes. If you buy a slightly more expensive electric toothbrush, it uses this kind of motor inside. But at the time, this was something completely new. At that time, these motors could only be used in CNC machine tools. That was around 2010 or 2011, and it was during this period that Professor Li Jiqiang was about to make his entrance. It's not that Professor Li Jixia stopped collaborating with everyone after helping solve that initial problem. In fact, he continued to encourage his students to intern with the team. Before this, Professor Li Jikai had also started a business and founded a company called Gugao Technology.
It was CNC machine tools.
Right, so the connection was made, and Professor Li Xiang also provided a lot of help. Of course, the motors they make for general use are still somewhat different from the motors used in CNC machine tools. The first thing is that it has to be smaller because it's for an aerial gimbal. So DJI also invested a lot of manpower, going through several rounds of talent to get this done. In 2012, DJI launched its first new generation gimbal called the Zenmuse Z15. Although it was just an accessory, that year DJI relied on this gimbal. Their revenue directly surpassed 100 million.
So this is a real necessity.
Right?
Yeah, that's true. Because without this gimbal, I feel like the value of aerial photography would be greatly diminished.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, from this you can also see DJI's approach to making products and Wang Tao's own pursuit. He never just makes an ordinary product that simply meets the industry's basic needs. He always aims to create something outstanding. Yes, in fact, he once explained that this drive comes from his admiration for beauty and his pursuit of coolness. He believes that his pursuit of beauty and coolness transforms into a kind of fighting power, enabling him to create these ultimate products that surpass everyone's imagination. Later he explained that this sense of beauty and coolness is actually a kind of taste. He said that DJI's choices in technology, product design, and even some of his business decisions are all related to this sense of taste.
Isn't this just like Steve Jobs? I actually wrote about this in an article not long ago. About 30 years ago, a reporter asked Steve Jobs, there are all kinds of technologies in the world leading in all sorts of directions, so how do you find the right path in the end? And Jobs replied, actually, the way to the very best path comes down to just two words, taste.
Domestic brands basically followed Apple and Samsung, iterating their products and drawing inspiration from their designs, and only later developed their own styles. Actually, I once heard a story. When a domestic smartphone company was making its first generation product, the designer was really ambitious and came up with a lot of original design ideas. But when he reported to the boss just threw the phone back at him and said, don't mess around with all this unnecessary stuff. Just copy the iPhone, can't you?
From a business perspective, learning from or drawing on a mature design is definitely very efficient because these classic designs have been validated countless times. People are willing to pay for them, they want to buy them. But those who are truly bold just want to create something original. And the outcome of originality is basically 0 or 1. Either you make it or you don't. 0 means you have nothing at all, while 1 means you're at the absolute forefront and leading the industry.
Right, but your chances of leading are a bit higher, and in pursuing this process, whether you end up with 0 or 1, you have to invest a huge amount of effort, energy, and resources to achieve your own goals.
Right.
So later, Forbes published an article describing Wang Tao's lifestyle at the time. Working 80 hours a week, 996, is only 72 hours, and he even set up a single bed next to his desk so he could just sleep there when he was exhausted. At the same time, Wang Tao also has a very distinct personality. If he sees a product he's not satisfied with, he'll send it back to be redone, often adding, "What kind of garbage is this?"
Didn't he say that you should leave your emotions out of it and just use your brain, but in the end?
Yeah, maybe that was meant for his employees to see.
Right.
But this kind of meticulousness or his pursuit of perfection in products, technology, and design actually gets reflected in his products. When it's reflected in the products, users can feel that they're being respected. That's why everyone pretty much likes DJI's products, though they're a bit expensive.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that Quinn is coming back. You can just imagine Quinn,
That's the producer who participated in the Amazing Race we just mentioned.
that reality show actor.
Right.
So when Quinn found out that everyone was developing such a brand new gimbal, he was really excited about it. Then, a month after that meeting, he flew to Shenzhen to meet with Wang Tao for a deeper conversation to see if both sides could pursue more in-depth cooperation. Actually, at that time, DJI's main market was still in Europe and America, since their economies were more developed. That's a very practical issue. They are quite interested in this matter.
I feel like he's actually quite suitable for this. As we just mentioned, he started an aerial photography company to do these things, so he should be pretty familiar with this whole setup. Plus, he's an actor, so he understands promotion and marketing. He's quite good at it.
You could say both sides hit it off right away, and then they set up a DJI North America company with him becoming the CEO. Then DJI took 52% of the shares and he took 48%. K-Yan really made significant contributions to DJI's expansion in the North American market. You could say he basically pushed DJI from a circle of enthusiasts into a much broader mainstream audience, and that's how he did it. The first thing he did was to take DJI's products, including the Spreading Wings and the Phantom, which was still in development at the time, to participate in all kinds of events, such as the Southwest Temple of Heaven Conference and the F1 US Grand Prix. The people attending these events were all into cool and innovative things. That's right, so the promotional effect was pretty good. In addition, he also interacted with celebrity friends he knew on social media, leveraging their influence to boost the promotion. He also recorded a lot of videos on YouTube himself, teaching people how to use drones. After raising awareness of the drone, he also helped everyone open up some new sales channels. Originally, it was only sold through some niche channels, like model aircraft websites or certain specialty shops.
A very narrow circle.
Right, and then it got into Best Buy.
Big box retailer.
Yes, a mainstream consumer electronics channel, even after the two sides fell out later on. When Wang Tao mentioned Colin, he would also say that Colin was indeed an outstanding marketing master, and many of his ideas were very inspiring to him. You have to know what kind of person Wang Tao is. During the same interview where he praised Colin, he also said that there is no one in the world he truly admires, not even Steve Jobs, but
they still had a falling out.
And that happened within just a year of the Phantom's launch. It was really fast. That was back in 2012. By then, everyone had already accumulated quite a bit of technical know-how for building highly integrated drones. They had already gone through several generations of hardware, and the flight control systems had become quite mature. That's when the Phantom product came about, with Colin involved in this as well. The US did a lot of groundwork for them, and there was already a lot of buzz even before the product was released. So by around January 2013, it sold out immediately. That's how a great thing, a great product, was born. So,
at that time, it felt like the Phantom had entered uncharted territory, right? The whole airspace was mine, with no competitors at all.
Yes, that was actually the market environment or industry background at the time.
Back then, hardly anyone was making complete drones. Few people building the whole thing.
Right?
Yeah.
If you were an enthusiast or a geek who wanted to play around, you'd still be following the old approach, DIY, or relying on lots of accessory manufacturers. They'd sell you the parts and you'd have to assemble a set yourself, or maybe put together a better flight control system to play with on your own.
So basically, DJI was ahead of the curve by being the first to integrate the flight control system and the whole drone into one complete product.
Right? And actually, there were others doing similar things too. For example, there was a European company called Pirate, and they made something called the AR Joe. Back then it was already available and quite cheap, just $200 or $300, but its features were pretty limited. It relied on Wi-Fi, and as you know, Wi-Fi has a very short transmission range. So while it did sell a bit, it wasn't really something that tech enthusiasts wanted to play with. Yeah. And this year, this product happens to hit both ends. It has their advantages while avoiding their shortcomings. First, in terms of advantages, the Phantom's product definitely has hovering as a basic skill, and its GPS control system has an extremely long signal transmission range reaching up to 1,000 meters.
How far can Wi-Fi go though?
Well, just think about when you use your phone with Wi-Fi.
Yeah,
It loses connection after a short distance.
right.
You can't control it after it goes a little farther, and even for those professionals, even hobbyists who fly drones, their control signal range is only a few hundred meters. Yeah, that's one thing. Another good point about the Phantom is that it's very beginner friendly, even if you're a complete newbie, someone who's never flown a drone before. After you get this product, you can assemble it within an hour and then fly it right away. The most important thing is still the price. This product sold for just under $700, which was really cheap. Back then, if you built your own flight control system with the drone, it could cost several thousand or even over $10,000. Although it was much more expensive than the AR drone, it still sold extremely well. Later on, both Wang Tao and Quinn reflected on the success of the Phantom, and their perspectives were very different. Wang Tao believed that they took advantage of the trend of making complete machines, which is the point you just mentioned. He said they were a bit like Ford in the automotive industry during the car era. Century, when
US machines.
the American auto industry was mainly focused on parts, and there were very few large-scale assembly plants like that. But after companies like Ford emerged, all those parts suppliers went out of business. He said that only by creating a complete integrated product could the market really be opened up, right? And it was because they seized on this point that the current situation developed. But Quinn's summary was much more sales-oriented. He said that if a user spends $100,000 on a set of equipment, they will definitely try every possible way to figure out how to use it. But if a user only spends $1,000, then they'll expect you to provide a product that is as perfect as possible, or even flawless, and extremely easy to use.
Yes, indeed. When a product becomes cheap enough to enter thousands of households, whether it's easy to use and user-friendly becomes a very important factor. That's the key metric. And I think what's even better is that DJI's product doesn't sacrifice performance just to make it cheaper or easier to use. Its excellent performance is still there, but they've managed to lower the difficulty of operation.
Right, and the price has also come down. But there's one thing to mention. The first generation of the Phantom didn't come with a camera. It just had a quick mount base for a GoPro. Actually, this is also related to the stage of development at the time. Back then, people didn't have such strong camera resources, so having a quick mount for a GoPro was a very reasonable market choice.
And GoPro's brand image is quite similar to theirs. At that time, GoPro was the world's #1 action camera and was very popular among young people. By collaborating with them, you could use GoPro's reputation for promotion, and both brands' user bases were quite similar.
Right?
Yeah.
But it was because of GoPro that Frank Wang ended up falling out with them. So what was Quinn's own idea? He thought, well, collaborating with GoPro is fine, but maybe we could take it a step further. For example, GoPro could make an action camera, or a camera, and we could make the drone, and then we could work together to create a product. But Frank Wang didn't agree because there was a detail. GoPro wanted 2/3 of the profits from this product. Then, really wanting to push this collaboration forward, he went ahead and agreed to it himself and signed the deal, which ended up being extremely awkward.
But I think from Frank Wang's perspective, it's understandable because, as we just mentioned, the main use case for drones at that time was photography, specifically aerial photography. With GoPro, when you attach it here, it's basically like handing over half your lifeblood to an external partner. So what does your drone become? It's just like a selfie stick. You're simply serving as a platform to carry the camera. So knowing Frank Wang's personality, I don't think he would want to hand over something so important. Handing over half your lifeblood to someone else.
Yeah, at this point, Frank Wang's ambition was no longer just to run a company of 10 or 20 people. His company had already grown quite large. At that time, he posted something in his WeChat Moments, which might have been written later. He wrote something like this. I can read it out for everyone. I'm tired of being a second-class citizen when it comes to culture, values, and products. I hope that one day our products can also make America bow down in admiration. So, in October 2013, just over half a year after the release of the first Phantom, they launched the second generation product, the Phantom 2 Vision Edition. Then, very soon after, they released another update, the Phantom 2 Vision Plus, which actually came with a gimbal and camera. That's the one we're holding right now. From its gimbal and camera, you can already see what a fully realized DJI drone product looks like. Highly integrated, extremely high integration. This Phantom was the one. So, the trigger for their falling out was actually between Colin Gin, and Wang Tao, and the rest of the team. Their goals or the kind of business they wanted to build were actually not aligned, so of course Colin didn't really understand Frank Wang's vision. And later on, Quinn also kind of lost his way. No one really knows what happened. He started claiming he was the CEO of DJI. He called himself the global CEO. He even dropped the North America part. If you check his LinkedIn profile now, you'll still see he lists himself as the CEO of DJI Innovations. It hasn't been updated yet. He also claims that without him, there would be no Phantom. His reasoning is very straightforward, just like we discussed earlier about naming. He said, take a look at DJI's product names before the Phantom came out. Wukong, Neja, and Zenmoose. All of these have a strong Eastern flavor, but Phantom sounds very Western, which wasn't DJI's style. At this point, Frank Wang was really dissatisfied with him.
I remember there was another incident around that time. We had previously talked with Mr. Li Dexiang, and he mentioned that he took Frank Wang to Silicon Valley to meet Morris, a partner at Sequoia Capital. During that meeting, they asked Morris 3 questions as they were exploring the future direction of DJI together. So, regarding those 3 questions, the first one was whether China could build its own brands. Morris told them that as long as your product is good, no matter where you are in the world, you can build a brand. Their second question was, if you want to build a brand, where's the best place to start? Morris told them, you should come to Silicon Valley, and in Silicon Valley, connect with these large tech companies. Especially, you should reach out to the founders of these major tech companies and have them help you spread the word about your product. The third question was related to organizing talent. So at that time, they gave DJI's Phantom, for example, to Chinese executives at Microsoft like Harry Shum. Then it was recommended to Bill Gates and later to even more Silicon Valley big names to help promote the product for them. Moreover, at that time, the attitudes toward drones in China and the US were completely different. In China back then, drones seemed like just toys and weren't widely recognized. But Morris had a very high opinion of the Phantom II. He compared it to the Apple II, which was Apple's 2nd generation computer. This computer holds tremendous significance in the history of personal computers. It was the first generation that made people aware of what a personal computer could be.
So, if you want to make it in the US, you can't just rely on research alone. Of course, the key is still my product. If it's strong enough, I won't be short of partners or friends. That's why Wang Tao started focusing on research. At first, the approach was pretty gentle. Basically, I took back the shares of DJI North America that you held and exchanged them for shares in DJI's global company, giving him 0.3%. Based on DJI's valuation at the time, those shares were worth about $5 million US, which is actually not bad. But Quinn didn't agree, saying that the Phantom sales in the US accounted for 30%, so what you offered really wasn't enough.
Yes, and he also believed that the name jingling was something he came up with himself.
He thought that he was the one who made jingling successful.
Yeah.
But after half a year of deadlock, Wang Tao stopped negotiating with him and just directly cut off all the official email addresses of DJI North America. He also transferred all the payments from DJI North America's distributors to the headquarters in Shenzhen.
That's ruthless, really ruthless.
And the most ruthless move was that right before Chinese New Year, he just fired all those people.
But I remember at that time, in the same year, DJI's headquarters in Shenzhen gave out 10 Mercedes-Benz cars to employees. So on one side, it's like fire, and on the other, it's like ice. The contrast in atmosphere was just completely different.
The contrast was huge, and then Kunlun went and sued everyone. They sued for more than half a year, and then they settled. At that point, everyone gave him nearly 10 million. People didn't really accept that number, but anyway, the dispute between Colin and DJI came to an end. After that, he went to another drone company called 3D Robotics. And just think about the state Colin was in when he left.
He must have left with a lot of anger, because he was holding in all that frustration, right?
Yeah. If he managed to make this product well at that company, then who actually made the Phantom wouldn't even matter. Everyone would know, and the facts would speak for themselves. Also, 3D Robotics is a very well-known company, and its founder is named Anderson. He's 20 years older than DJI's Frank Wang, and he's a veteran journalist. Actually, he's in the same industry as me. He started out as the editor-in-chief at Wired magazine, and later wrote a very famous business book called The Long Tail. Many people have probably heard of this book. In 2007, when he was 46, he took his 2 kids to play with programmable Lego robots and a remote-controlled airplane. He realized he was really interested in this stuff. Actually, he was more interested in it than his kids were. He started a website, basically an enthusiast forum called DIY Drones, which brought together all the drone hobbyists. This forum actually gave rise to a lot of things, such as open source software for multi-rotor flight systems.
This is what we mentioned earlier. It's a really popular open source community.
Yes, a lot of contributions came from this community. So you can see that from the very beginning, they had competitors. And then there was his company, 3D Robotics. When Anderson left Wired to become the full-time CEO of this company, he even wrote an article saying, "I accidentally sparked the consumer drone boom."
But in the end, DJI was the one who won.
And the tension in the competition between them was also very high. Besides what you just mentioned about open source, many companies in Shenzhen started using their open source software to make their own drones. So when they launched the product that year, Wang Tao even said this: "The reason for setting the price so low was to prevent everyone from engaging in a price war. He knew exactly what his peers in Shenzhen were doing. Yes, and seeing how successful this company had become, they also started making hardware." At this point, when Chris Quinn came in, things became even more confrontational. So the tension between these two companies was very obvious by then.
Yes.
Anderson also defined the roles for both sides. If you're the Apple of the drone industry, then I'll be the Android of the drone industry.
That prediction sounds pretty ironic now. After all, just look at what happened when Google tried to use Android for their phones.
Well, it actually worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
But at that time, in their eyes, DJI wasn't actually that strong yet. First of all, 3D Robotics had raised over 80 million US dollars at the time, which is several hundred million RMB, so they had plenty of funding to support the development of a really good first generation product. Plus, I had the entire open source software community behind me, with everyone helping to optimize together. They could also help me optimize the hardware design together. Plus, everyone was using the Chinese supply chain, the Shenzhen supply chain, right? I could use it too, it was open to everyone. And I also had the marketing expert, Chris Anderson, helping me out. He understood how everyone was doing things. So that gave me the confidence to go ahead and do something like this. After Chris Anderson joined, they started a new product project called Solo. Well, the Phantom is white, but their Solo was black, kind of similar. Internally, they called it the Phantom Killer. They wanted to take down the Phantom to beat us. Indeed, their Solo product did have some highlights. For example, they included some computing power both in the drone itself and in its remote controller. They claimed that this would make the flight control system more stable and also allow for more precise and sophisticated control. As for controlling the GoPro, since Chris Anderson went over there, their collaboration with GoPro became even deeper, which was something he had always wanted to achieve. One of the most impressive things he always wanted to achieve was actually the after-sales service. They offered a 30-day no questions asked return and exchange policy. Even after that period, if your drone crashed, they would investigate whose fault it was. If it was the user's fault, they would offer you a replacement at a discounted price.
Wow.
If it was indeed 3D Robotics' fault, they would most certainly just give you a completely free replacement without any hesitation.
That's really going all in.
Yes, they came on really strong, and Wang Tao got very nervous. He even flew to the US specifically to meet Anderson and suggested, why don't we stop competing? We'll just fully acquire you. But Anderson turned him down.
Now, finally, it's someone else's turn to reject Wang Tao, but they must have been pretty happy to hear that, because it felt like maybe Wang Tao was a little scared at that point.
But what was the result? Within a year of Solo's launch, it collapsed.
Actually.
There were all kinds of reasons, but I think the core issue was that they weren't honest enough. Before the product launched, they had the media review it. The editor at The Verge gave it a really high rating, saying it was the smartest drone to date, better than everyone else. Just hearing that, it sounded like it was better than all the competition. But later, some 3D Robotics employees revealed that the drone sent for review had actually been specially modified, especially the GPS module, which was an enhanced version. But the GPS module in the mass production version,
it was nowhere near as good.
Right. So this led to a problem. Its signal control was really poor, extremely poor, which made it prone to crashing. And when it crashed, the drone would just fall out of the sky.
So, as I just mentioned, the whole 30-day free return and exchange policy, I think the catch is right here. Maybe they had a guilty conscience, knowing their product wasn't good enough, so they offered such an attractive policy to lure people in. And honestly, for people who really want to fly drones, it's actually really annoying. I buy a drone to use it, not to crash it and then exchange it, right?
Yeah, actually at this point, we can't really be too harsh on them, but the truth is they really didn't do a good job.
Right.
And what's even more critical is, as we just discussed, the gimbal. They released this product in 2015, and even then, their product still didn't have a gimbal, because the technology barrier for gimbals is still pretty high, especially for the newer types of gimbals. Not many people have open sourced them. In fact, almost no one has. So at that time, the research team said something like, we never expected that finding a gimbal would be even harder than finding a drone. But on the other hand, DJI had already made gimbals a standard feature of their drones by then, so the aerial photography experience just couldn't compare to DJI's Phantom series. But the executives at 3D Robotics were also very confident. They saw that many distributors were placing orders to buy their products, so they went to the manufacturers and asked them to increase production by another 40,000 units.
So these distributors placed orders because they saw the promotion on The Verge, right?
Not exactly.
Ah.
They really hyped it up, but what were these distributors actually doing with the products they bought? They just put them on the shelves or in the warehouse and they still haven't sold.
They couldn't sell them.
Or were they simply just patiently waiting for the Christmas season, you know? Some of them
stocked.
Yeah, they stocked up early, which ended up clogging the distribution channels. The result was pretty tragic. By February 2016, after that year's Christmas had passed. And a long time had gone by, but they still had a backlog in the warehouse.
60,000 units. That was basically a nightmare, I think.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about consumer electronics, once you stockpile inventory, the next year there will be new devices and new technology coming out, so your old stock becomes completely worthless. It's just like seafood. It might just go bad.
Right, but to be fair, the Solo product did have some highlights.
Yeah.
If it had been given time for continuous iteration and improvement, it could have turned into something good, but no one was willing to give it that time. So in terms of revenue, it was released, and then shortly after, the Solo was launched. Then everyone released the Phantom 3, which was yet another groundbreaking product. At this point, DJI had already mastered every aspect of drone technology, so for 3D robotics, this was a devastating blow. And the price was even more aggressive. When they launched this product, the professional version was priced at $1,300. It was already quite expensive, but the Solo was even pricier. The Solo plus the GoPro added up to $1,700.
There was a big price difference.
Then, over the next year, DJI released all kinds of versions based on the Phantom 3, with the cheapest one going for as low as $800.
Yeah.
And during promotions, it could be sold for as low as $500. So basically, they crushed the competition, leaving them in total defeat. After that, you could just look at the revenue numbers to see the outcome. The founder left the company during this period of upheaval, and Anderson made the following statement as his exit message. He said, "We're a Silicon Valley company. Software is our real business. That's what we're good at. As for hardware, it's better to leave that to these Chinese companies."
But the problem is, their software actually isn't as good as everyone else's.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I once heard a story. Back in 2014, DJI's flight control lead wrote on a whiteboard who their real competitors were. Among all the drone companies, their names were written really small. The biggest one was actually Boeing. It's not that they wrote Boeing just to treat it as an imaginary enemy or because they wanted to enter the manned aircraft field, but rather because they wanted to solve a major industry challenge, namely reliability. At that time, DJI's flight control systems had a pretty high crash rate, so much so that a website called Huoche was created specifically to discuss these crash incidents. Their flight control team set a very ambitious goal. They wanted to be like Boeing and reduce the accident rate to just a few per million flight. Yeah, and Frank Wang's ambition was clear. He said, "Our goal isn't just to be number one in Shenzhen. If you only aim to be the best in Shenzhen, then that's probably all you'll ever achieve." Even being number one in Shenzhen was just a stepping stone for him. His real goal was to be number one in the world. And once he reached the top globally and there was no one left to compare to, he would look for the best in the field to benchmark against. So after our competition with Shandy Robotics came to an end, DJI had already reached a pretty terrifying level. Like we mentioned at the beginning, they had already captured 70% of the market share. That dominance was already established by then.
Yes.
But there was still a huge problem.
Domestically, there were still quite a few competitors emerging at that time.
At this point, domestic investors and entrepreneurs no longer saw DJI as just a toy company, because DJI's momentum in the US and abroad was obvious to everyone. People could see that this was actually a highly profitable market. So in these 2 years, a huge number of drone startups emerged and received a lot of investment. For example, Xiaomi supported a company called Fimi, which is part of its ecosystem. Around this time, there were also people who, during the same period as Wang Tao, were working on flight control systems. And compared to Wang Tao, those who were working on flight control systems also received a lot of investment. For example, as I just mentioned, companies like Jifei, which now focuses on agricultural drones, as well as Yihang, and then there was Tianyu, who almost became a key investment target for everyone at the time. Then there was also Aoxiang and Zerotech in this area. Some companies like those led by Yang Jianjun were actually competitors, but after realizing they really couldn't beat everyone else, they shifted to fields that weren't the main focus of others' investments. For example, Jifei focused on agricultural drones, while Yihang moved into transport drones and even developed some manned aircraft. But there were still some stubborn ones who believed that, by following Xiaomi's approach, they could also succeed in making drones. Because at that time, Xiaomi was really at its peak. It was before 2016, before Xiaomi encountered setbacks. Among the representative companies here, there were two. One was Fimi, supported by Xiaomi, and the other was Zerotech.
So I think the core of Xiaomi's model is to drive the price down, right? Or you could say making things extremely easy to use and extremely convenient.
Right.
Yeah, and it's
Actually, among these, the product that Yang Jianjun and his team at Zerotech made was quite in line with that approach. They made a product called Dobby, which sold for less than 2,000 yuan. It was extremely lightweight and even foldable, with portability as its main selling point. It weighed about as much as a smartphone, maybe just a bit heavier. To promote it, they did a lot of marketing, even inviting Liu Yan, who was a very popular actress at the time, to be the spokesperson. They stocked up 200,000 units, aiming for a big hit in the portable market.
It really was a great concept, because if you look at the drones back then, including the Phantom series, they were heavy, still just too heavy, which for many people, well, it was fine for families, but for people who wanted to fly anytime, anywhere, it just wasn't that convenient.
I truly feel that for some serious and dedicated hobbyists, it's definitely worth the effort to carefully carry it around.
Right?
But for the general public, they just think, oh, this thing is too complicated to use. They just wouldn't want to use it. But as we just mentioned, when DJI makes products, there's a very important point. It's not like they sacrifice performance just to pursue the idea of portability. This is the version that everyone came up with, called the Mavic Pro. After this product came out, you could see a very clear characteristic. They didn't get into a price war with companies like DJI or Zerotech. At the time, it sold for over 6,000 yuan, which was quite expensive. You could buy several other drones for that price. Moreover, it still tried to maintain as much of the original drone performance as possible. For example, Zerotech's product also used a similar technical approach. It seemed to use Wi-Fi control as well, so its user experience wasn't that great either. Yeah, so even though it was cheaper, the Mavic Pro still outsold it by a lot, so the outcome was pretty obvious. In the end, the Adobe ended up piling up in warehouses just like the so-called DJI killer, the Solo, and eventually it was DJI that helped clear out a lot of their inventory.
I actually think he was pretty lucky, because if he had already finished dealing with 3D robotics and then had to face these domestic competitors at the same time, if both sides attacked together, I think it would have been really hard for him to handle.
Yes, but I think Wang Tao himself probably still feels a bit fortunate about it. What if the Mavic Pro had been a product from another company? That same year, everyone also released a product called the Phantom 4, which was an iteration of the Phantom series, but after the Mavic Pro was launched, the sales of the Phantom series just were not as good anymore. Looking back, they reflected on this and realized that only self-reform leads to innovation, so eventually the Phantom series was discontinued.
But actually, you can also see that those domestic competitors at the time had pretty good vision. They saw this coming. The trend was not moving toward heavier, more professional products, but rather toward products for the general public.
That's right, but everyone was still pretty good at defending their positions. So now, those who want to challenge DJI really need to think carefully about whether they have the strength to compete with them.
Yes, because after years of development, DJI's technology has a compounding effect. With every yearly iteration and update, their technological barriers keep getting stronger. So for newcomers entering the market, I think it's quite difficult. But in recent years, it's also clear that everyone's updates have become more and more routine. Kind of like the iPhone, there just aren't any truly stunning products coming out anymore. Maybe the FPV drone counts as one, the one you play with wearing goggles. But now it's definitely not like before, where every new generation would make people go, wow.
Yeah, actually, maybe the impact just isn't as noticeable anymore. They've already raised the bar in terms of experience, aesthetics, and how it feels.
But
actually, there's another factor. At this point, DJI had already reached a point where no one could shake its position in the market. In fact, the US government started paying attention to DJI quite early on, around 2015. That was when some US government staff discovered that there was suddenly a DJI drone on the White House lawn. Even their security system couldn't figure out how it had managed to get there. Everyone got really nervous and tried to investigate how it got there. Later, one of their intelligence officers came forward and admitted it was him. He said that the night before he had been drinking too much and was playing with the drone and accidentally flew it in there. So at that time, actually, similar incidents were happening in other countries as well. For example, in Japan, some protesters used DJI drones to carry nuclear waste and dropped it directly onto the roof of the Japanese Prime Minister's residence. But Wang Tao remained quite calm about these events. He felt that with higher sales, all sorts of incidents like this would inevitably occur. Moreover, they respected the needs of these governments, so they created a virtual fence, meaning they don't allow drones to take off in certain areas.
But I think there's really nothing you can do about it. In the context of geopolitics, if they want to say you have a problem, then you have a problem. They'll always find something to fault you for.
However, it's actually quite difficult for the US government to suppress DJI. First of all, their usual tactic for targeting a Chinese company is something everyone is very familiar with, the Entity List. The consequence of being placed on the Entity List is that companies on it are no longer allowed to use technology from American companies or technology that has significant American contributions. For example, when it comes to making chips, once your company is put on the Entity List, you're basically cut off from advanced manufacturing processes. However, most of the core technologies in DJI's drones are self-developed. While they do use some American components, they can quickly find alternatives. It's not like they absolutely have to use those cutting-edge 3nm or 5nm chips to deliver an exceptional experience. So, in reality, the Entity List is ineffective for companies like this. Then, your second move is to impose tariffs. When you raise tariffs, prices go up. But even with higher prices, Americans still buy the products. Even when they later banned their own government employees and soldiers from buying DJI products, it didn't matter. They still bought them because there simply aren't good alternatives on the market. The military especially, yes, that's right. And then just a while ago, the United States raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 145% and even up to 200% in some cases. At that time, DJI happened to release a new generation of drones. They were very savvy about it and chose not to launch in the US. However, American drone retailers still found special channels to import them. And the drones sold extremely well in those stores, which just shows how formidable DJI's influence really is.
And this kind of influence was achieved through genuine market competition, not through so-called administrative measures, regulatory barriers, or by relying on any unique or privileged resources.
Yes, but in 2016, Frank Wang also realized a problem. Although from 2008 to 2016, over those 8 years, DJI's revenue had skyrocketed, expanding nearly 10,000 times. That year alone, their revenue had already reached around 10 billion yuan. However, he also felt that their growth rate was slowing down. In the early days, they were growing at a rate of 1,000% or even faster. But by this time, their growth rate was only about 6. So he made a judgment, wondering whether the drone market, especially the consumer drone market, was becoming saturated.
Now, how do we find the second wave of growth?
Right, actually, at this point, DJI entered its next stage, which involved doing two things. First, defense, and second, expansion. In terms of defense, if we look at DJI's official website now, it's actually very clear. They have 7 product lines for aerial photography drones, which are what we call consumer drones, ranging from large to small. They have high-performance consumer models, ones for ordinary users, and some that are just really cool. Basically, they have covered the entire track. So I'm still quite curious to see what kind of product Insta360 can come up with to compete with them.
And what new angle or entry point they can find to break into the market and compete.
Right, and on the other hand, what they want to do is push drones into certain industry applications, like what DJI is doing, for example, agricultural drones, or excelling in mapping scenarios, or power grid inspections. If I do particularly well in these areas, I can develop a fixed solution to provide support for these people and then sell it to them. Their most recent drone product is a large transport helicopter that can carry 300 jin of cargo and fly 50 kilometers.
And besides these, they've actually developed many products outside of drones as well, right? Like the handheld gimbals and action cameras we just mentioned, including robotic vehicles and so on.
Yes, actually, if we look at their expansion over the years, we can draw a series of concentric circles. At the center is their core consumer-grade drone. Then moving outward are their various industrial or enterprise-grade drone products for different scenarios, and then further out are the products you just mentioned, like gimbals, handheld gimbal cameras, action cameras, and so on. They are actually derivatives of drone technology.
Right, it's all part of the same lineage, just extending the technology from drones to these other smaller products.
For example, this thing we see here is basically just a gimbal and camera from the Phantom series. We took it off, made it smaller, and added a handheld component to complete the product. Actually, it does feel a bit like that. Of course, when they were making this product, they really put a lot of effort into it. This is the first generation wearable camera, and even for this product, they went through 3 design iterations. The first version was actually just a rectangular block, and then the camera head extended out from the top. This version wasn't nearly as portable. The second version was actually a phone accessory. You would attach it to your phone, and that was the experience they wanted to provide. The final version, which is the one we have now, is extremely portable and compact. Their concept was that this product isn't meant to be a replacement for your phone. Instead, it can do things that a phone simply can't. For example, the most direct experience is that this camera, combined with its gimbal, achieves a precision within 0.0005. They believe that if the precision exceeds this threshold, the footage captured by the camera will definitely be shaky, and users will definitely notice it. That's why they pushed it to such an extreme level.
Indeed, whether we're talking about DJI's handheld products or those used on the ground, the complaints we hear are actually much louder than those about their drones. Take this device, for example. One of its main issues is heat dissipation, which is really hard to solve.
Yes, and that's not even the most serious issue, especially with this generation of prod.
UCTs.
Everyone thought the action camera was super cool when it was first released. It looked really impressive. It was actually quite different from everyone's first generation action cameras. But the first generation action camera was actually pretty similar to the GoPro. The biggest difference was that it had an extra screen on the front, so when users took selfies with the camera, they could see themselves in the frame. This gave people a foothold in the action camera market. But there were also a lot of complaints. People said, "Isn't this just a copy of the GoPro?" For the second generation, they made a very bold design. It was a continuous snap-on design, and then they turned the front screen into a magnetic module.
A separate, detachable piece.
Right. So this small camera, is actually an independent action camera, a miniaturized GoPro, but after shrinking it down, it faced huge problems. As we've been saying, just because they've made something small doesn't mean they have to sacrifice performance. They made sure that when you take this thing out and use it, the performance is always up to par. To achieve that, they use some high-quality small components, and these small components usually have one characteristic. That is, they have very high power, extremely high, which means they tend to generate a lot of heat. But when it comes to heat generation, for most people, it's not really a problem because the high-performance motors used in drones can handle it. Now, there are cooling vents on them, and when the rotors spin, the airflow helps cool things down. But that's not the case for action cameras. There's a very important point. They need to be extremely well sealed because I might use them while diving or in situations where if I drop the camera, it can't let water in. Otherwise, it would be unusable. So the sealing has to be especially strong. But with such strong sealing and with high power consumption, it's easy for the camera to overheat. The result, it gets hot to the touch. There's just no way around it. In fact, DJI even advised users about this when they released the product. They told you not to record such long videos, which is honestly pretty ridiculous. So with the third generation of action cameras, they actually went back to the original approach. But this magnetic attachment isn't just for putting the camera away. There are other products, when you add accessories, also use this magnetic system. Especially with their recent panoramic cameras, the magnetic concept is still there.
So it's very clear that this model, when DJI made this, they didn't actually stick to what they had always done. The usual method is just to be cool. Being flashy is fine, but the premise is that it has to be practical or easy to use. If you lose those two prerequisites, then no matter how cool it looks, it's actually useless.
But even with these setbacks, their action cameras still sell pretty well in this field. Right now, they're second in the global market, just behind GoPro.
Because your technology is right there. Everything you make now, whether it's gimbals or cameras, all builds on your drone technology. So I think this position, this status, is still very hard for anyone to challenge.
Yeah, and they also acquired Hasselblad, so when it comes to photography performance, there's no doubt about their strength. But if we look at that concentric circle we just mentioned, if we keep looking further,
And draw circle,
it's not just about drawing another circle anymore.
right, because it's no longer just a technical line for them.
There's a connection, but the connection has already... You can't really call it a concentric circle anymore. For example, when they did the DJI Auto Show, that was actually a very, very unique move. Many employees and some investors felt the same way. That's what makes it a special case for everyone. When they developed this driver assistance system, which is actually DJI's in-car business, there was still some technical continuity. The continuity point is what we just mentioned about the Spark series. The latest generation of Spark products used dual vision, and this introduced AI, meaning computer vision related technology, which made it possible. Visual autonomous obstacle avoidance, and then autonomous following, so I can recognize that this is a person and I can track them. The technological advancement here was quite significant, and it started to feel a bit like developing driver assistance or even autonomous driving for cars. So at that time, they gathered some teams to explore this direction. Back in 2016, the whole autonomous vehicle startup scene was still booming, and everyone was trying out two different directions. They worked on level 2 level driver assistance systems, as well as level 4 level autonomous driving systems. And at the time, they experimented with all kinds of hardware, though some of it never made it to market. For example, they considered making unmanned delivery vehicles, and also thought about developing autonomous agricultural machinery, in other words, agricultural drones. That made sense, and they also thought about buying a car company themselves to directly make an unmanned taxi for passenger vehicles, which was also an option. But after all that effort, what they ended up with was just this driver assistance system that everyone shows off at auto shows.
Right, but that's just... Car manufacturers themselves want to do it, and there are a bunch of startups in the market working on it too, so it's really hard to come up with a business that stands out. So the methodologies DJI used in the past might really be hard to apply here. Because as we've emphasized repeatedly, first of all, DJI used to have a technological edge. But up to now, assisted driving technology hasn't reached a breakthrough point. So no matter how much you refine it, users' perception is still very limited, and you can't really leverage DJI's unique advantages here. We also mentioned that DJI makes really cool products. It's very cool, but this assisted driving is basically just air. It's not a tangible product. It's hard for people to feel that it's cool. And as for ease of use, that's not quite right either. Normally, now you just press a button or flick the
joystick.
Right, and then it works. How much more convenient can it get?
Exactly. DJI Car Show isn't even called DJI Car Show anymore.
Yeah.
The name DJI is already gone. Now it's called Joyu.
Right.
Actually, the two products that best embody DJI style, in my opinion, are really the RoboMaster. This RoboMaster, the RoboMaster S1, is super cool. Its origin actually comes from the robot competitions that Wang Tao and everyone at DJI have always loved.
Competition.
Exactly.
From college, they participated in these competitions countless times.
They started participating in college, and after achieving some results, they began sponsoring these competitions. Originally, this product was actually something only enthusiasts in robot competitions would use. But then everyone turned it into a product, kind of like what happened with drones. At first, it was just a niche group of enthusiasts working on it, but then we made it into a mass consumer product. When this product was launched, a lot of people really liked it, myself included. I really liked it. In fact, a lot of people just loved it. But then a series of things happened afterward. The most significant was the double reduction policy, because this product was designed for middle school students. It was used for programming education. Its main sales channels were still those educational training institutions, and then there were some policy factors as well, yes. And then this became a relic of its time.
Yes.
Of course, later on they also made a product which is an electric assist 3D bicycle. The positioning of this product was rather odd, so it was named Anliu. DJI said it was a brand incubated by them, and what they mainly provided was an electric assist system. So this is quite a peripheral product, and we won't go into detail about it here. However, its price also made it hard for ordinary people to access, starting at 36,000 yuan for an electric assist 3D bicycle. That's just too expensive.
But if you look at making a robot vacuum, there really aren't so many external obstacles, right? For example, you don't have to worry about being affected by policies. And you don't have to set a very high price to cover your costs, since the costs aren't that high. But even so, it still took them 4 years to make it.
Yeah.
Right.
Smartphone supply chain mature.
Exactly.
You could also make a cheaper version.
Right.
I've also talked with friends about this, and the impression I get is that in recent years, DJI's approach to making products hasn't been as pure as before. If we look back, DJI's product strategy, take drones for example, was really about creating products and technologies that the general consumer could perceive and appreciate. I made it, provided them with this product, and let them realize that they had this need, so it succeeded. Take our handheld gimbal camera, the Pocket, for example. Before DJI made this product, there was nothing like it on the market. And then there's the action camera as well. Even though it's now a thing of the past, that form factor was still very bold. But whether it's the robot vacuum or the outdoor projector, these are all products in highly competitive markets where consumer needs are already quite clear.
They're no longer the pioneers in those areas, but rather followers.
Yeah, my friend told me that actually when everyone is working on these projects, a deeper motivation is actually to retain their own employees. As we just mentioned, those companies making robot vacuums are always poaching people, and the outdoor power supply business was started by a group of former engineers. Besides these people, some others have also left. For example, Wang Mingyu, who was in charge of the Vision edition of the Genie 2, has also left. The founder of Tuoju, whom I just mentioned, was actually the person in charge of DJI's key product, the Mavic Pro. His name is Tao Ye. Then, earlier this year, there was a widely discussed news story. DJI lost 4 core team members. News like this has been circulating all the time. And when these people leave, it's not like they're leaving alone. When one person goes, they can take a whole group of DJI people with them. So if you look at the companies founded by former DJI employees, you'll see that DJI people tend to cluster together.
The concentration of DJI people extremely high.
Right, so everyone wants to prove that by staying at DJI, they can also create this kind of product.
Indeed, because as Wang Tao mentioned before, his own assessment is that the drone market has already reached saturation. Also, with each new generation of DJI products, the sense of excitement isn't as strong as it used to be. So what should you do next? How do you motivate your employees to stay? Should you create new opportunities for them or provide a new stage for them to express themselves? I think this is a major question for him. Also, by that time, after 2016, China's mobile phone industry had become very mature, and the entire supply chain was also highly developed. IoT and all kinds of consumer electronics startups were booming, so you can't blame your own employees, right? If you don't provide opportunities, of course, they'll want to look for opportunities elsewhere.
So when they leave, it's to start their own businesses, right? And they have their own equity. Whereas at DJI, even though this product is very profitable, as we just mentioned, the market's impression of Wang Tao is that he pursues perfection, and he actually pays his employees quite well. But still, the allure of opportunities outside is hard to resist. Because outside, they might be able to gain even more wealth. In 2019, everyone actually took a systematic look at the company's vision. That is, I want to be a pioneer in the era of spatial intelligence. Let the beauty of technology surpass imagination. I admit, even when I say it myself, it sounds a bit awkward. A friend of mine once talked to me about it. He said that when he first heard these 2 lines, he had no idea what they meant. Later, when Wang Tao was interviewed, he also explained what this actually means. What he really cares about is the atmosphere. This is how he put it. Birds move so nimbly through the rainforest, flying so gracefully, gliding past branch after branch, but never touching a single twig. So what does spatial intelligence mean? It means I equip robots with these sensors, giving them the ability to perceive space. And then, by using some advanced intelligent algorithms, I can make the robot fly like a bird.
That's right.
And that is the beauty of machines.
Now I'm starting to believe that the name Spirit was probably chosen by Wang Tao, and maybe not by Queen.
Yes, and from our current perspective, looking at DJI's product lineup, you can actually sense a bit of that spatial intelligence, from flying cameras in the sky, to cameras you hold in your hand, to products on the ground. One of my friends even specifically mentioned this to me. So when we talk about spatial intelligence here, although Wang Tao used birds as a metaphor, he's not just talking about drones.
Yeah, it really does feel like spatial intelligence. Drones are a technology for the sky, but now you're taking that aerial technology and putting it into people's hands and onto the ground. Yeah.
And even though we just said that these products have broken through to places beyond the original concentric circles, at the very least, they're still related to this core.
Yeah.
For example, we just mentioned DJI's product in Nanjing, the one with binocular vision. Actually, most robot vacuums now also use binocular vision. But
I think for DJI to make this robot vacuum, they still need to break through some of their own limitations. We just mentioned the Tuoju product, which is a 3D printer. One of the characteristics of 3D printers is that in the past, the threshold for use and the technical barrier were both very high. Tuoju lowered the technical and usage barriers to the minimum, bringing this kind of product into thousands of households. But coming back to today's robot vacuums, this is a home appliance that has already been developed for many, many years. Would you say it still has any significant usage barriers or technical hurdles? It seems like it doesn't. Even if the technology improves by 50%, people wouldn't really feel that much of a difference. To be honest, of course there are improvements, but the perception isn't that strong. And can you really say it's super cool or flashy? Personally, I just can't imagine it ever reaching a level of coolness that blows my mind. So right now,
it's just a transparent shell. Maybe it can only
change its product through some minor design tweaks here and there. And actually,
honestly, if DJI could really achieve a 50% technological breakthrough, I think that would be truly impressive. That would be a real breakthrough.
I think it would break through people's imagination or even their understanding.
But in reality, that's very hard to achieve.
Because,
after all, there are a bunch of your former employees working right next to you, and they know all your tricks.
Yeah, and especially with this kind of mass consumer product, I think the difference from things like drones or 3D printers back then is its marketing efforts have to be really solid. And for this type of mass consumer product, marketing actually plays a huge role. You could even say that 70% of what this company needs is marketing ability. For example, Dream will just dump a whole bucket of instant noodles on the floor. And then with just a swipe of their detergent, right?
It gets cleaned up instantly.
It gets cleaned up right away, and that gives viewers a really strong sense of emotional value. But it seems like DJI has never really wanted to or been good at doing things like this.
Yeah, what they're actually good at is focusing on technology research.
Right.
Product design, making the specs as perfect as possible.
Right.
So when they officially announce a new product, it's always entirely about the technical specs, very much spec heavy.
Yeah, and their marketing is basically like, after my users use my drone, they can shoot really cool footage and then upload it online, rather than actively saying, oh, my drone is so cool, so awesome. They rarely do things like that.
At most, they might do some product demos.
Or maybe they did, but it didn't go viral, which shows they're not strong in this area.
Yeah, exactly. So things like robot vacuums and panoramic cameras are still pretty important for everyone.
Right.
If they make a good product, it can actually help slow down employee turnover.
Yes.
Actually, Professor Li Jiqiang also talked to us in a previous interview about how to address or deal with DJI's high employee turnover or frequent personnel changes. He said this: can we make a good product? Can we launch the product? That's extremely important.
The second thing he said, I think, is even more crucial, right? You have to make the product first, and then we can talk about whether it's good or not.
Exactly. So internally, everyone tried a lot of innovative projects, but
they didn't
launch.
Few made out.
Robot vacuum easier.
At least there was a robot vacuum that came out.
Yeah, the robot vacuum was something we struggled with for so many years, revised it twice, and finally it was released. I think the robot vacuum isn't just about retaining employees for everyone. Its greater significance lies in whether, in such a fiercely competitive market, especially when you add in the 360-degree camera, both of which are extremely competitive markets, can we achieve success in this market? Wang Tao once said something like this. He said that DJI's most valuable asset is actually not its products or technology, but its methodology. That is its greatest wealth. So both the robot vacuum and the 360-degree camera actually go beyond that. Originally, their technological boundaries were somewhat more limited, and they also needed to make up for their shortcomings in other areas. So if they can succeed, it proves that their methodology or their ability to learn is not limited to drones or drone-related products, which means it would be an even greater achievement for DJI, yes. Okay, that brings our story about DJI to a close. Thank you to everyone who helped us in the making of this episode. If you found this video podcast helpful, please like, follow, and save it. We will do our best to create more inspiring content for you.
We're already working hard on producing the second episode, and the protagonist of our next episode, like Wang Tao, is also someone born in the 1980s. His company, like DJI, has also created products that are hugely popular around the world. We hope you'll look forward to it. If there are other companies or brands you'd like to learn more about, feel free to leave us a comment. That's it for this episode.
Bye-bye.